When a shipwreck at sea in the 1500s left families wondering about the fate of their loved ones, rabbinic authorities debated whether the wives of the missing passengers could remarry. This centuries-old question resurfaced in 1912 with the famous sinking of the Titanic, reigniting the discussion of applying Halachah in tragic circumstances. The Mabit, Reb Moshe ben Yosef Trani, lived in the 1500s in Tzfas, one of the great poskim of his generation. And in Shilas Teshuvas Mabit of the Mabit, Chelek Aleph Simin Kuf Pevav, we read the following tragic case. Maaseh Shahaya Bechama Yehudim, there was a story with a number of Jews. Sha'alu Bisfina Gadola, they boarded a large vessel, a ship, Shahaya Ba Kama Meyos Yishmaelim, that had a few hundred Arabs, Muslims. Most of the passengers and most of the cargo was in the cabin, and the cabin was what he's calling here the lower chamber of this boat, which is positioned below the deck, where the owners of the ship and the sailors are present. There's only one way to access the cabin, and that is there's one door on the deck through which you can descend to the cabin. That is the way you can go up and down from the deck to the cabin. Suddenly, and unfortunately, there was a very big storm at sea. The Nepcha Hasafina Derech Tzida Ha'alef, and the ship started to tilt in one direction. And now water is pouring forth into the cabin of the ship. Amongst the people at the top, most of the people, passengers, were in the cabin below. But amongst the people at the top, which were the sailors and others, there were 3 or 4 Jews with some of the Arabs above. And when they saw that this ship is going under, the Jews who were on the deck opened up the door to the cabin, and they spoke to their brethren down in the cabin. And they were crying. And they were pleading to Hashem, they were davening. And they were going through the process of vidui, of repenting for their sins while they were crying, and they were doing this together, one with the other. Because those people in the cabin felt death coming upon them. Suddenly, now the ship turns over entirely. It sounds like the door remained open, but the ship suddenly turned over. So all the people who were standing on the deck were pushed into the sea, and they're swimming now around the area of the boat. In order to save themselves, they climbed onto the hull of the ship, the walls of the ship, which now has been turned over. So the people, again, who are on the deck and who were thrown off into the sea and are now hanging on to the hull of the ship, they're there for about a half hour. But this vessel is sinking slowly, until finally it did indeed sink under the water and go to the bottom. The people who were hanging on the hull, obviously they had to get off. So shatu bayam, they went back swimming into the sea, lisfina katana, to a lifeboat, hameshameshas ligdola, which was part of the larger boat. Apparently there was a small lifeboat available with some of the people who were on the top of the boat, the owners of the vessel. Perhaps some of the sailors jumped into it. So now the people who were previously on the hull of the ship, now they start running over toward this vessel. However, verubam nitbu, most of the people who were on the hull and now had to go back into the water, most of them now drowned. Uksasam alu lisfina, however, some of them did manage to get to the lifeboat. Uvechlalam, and amongst them nimlutu beis Yehudim bisfina aktana, 2 Jews managed to get up into this small lifeboat. Ve'echad mehem, and one of them, higiapoi, comes to here. The Mabit is writing, it's tzvas, presumably it's tzvas. V'higid mashakasu lamayla, and he told us this entire story, everything that is delineated above. V'shakala anashim, he also said, Shakala anashim shayu lamayla bisvina shalohi sigul lisvina kana, all the people who were originally on the deck, who were poured out, who were flipped over into the water, who went onto the hull, right, and then had to go back into the water, all of them nitbu sham, they all drowned. In fact, this is not just a guess. He saw it. They saw them, their dead bodies, floating on the surface of the water. Amongst them was Gimel Yehudi. 3 Jews were in this situation. And in fact, they got later more information. Kiyatsu, what they learned is, Kiyatsu tzafim al pnei amayim mesim le'i shio. And that is, there's a Greek isle that is known as Chios. And this is one of the Greek islands. It's between Greece and Turkey. And these 3 Jews who they saw floating dead on the surface of the water eventually washed up at the shore at Chios, at this Greek island, V'kvarum sham, and they were buried over there. Ava, the testimony continued, all of this was only, whatever he said till now, was all about the few Jews who are on the deck. Again, if you want to follow what happened, they were position A, they're in the deck. Position B, they're pushed into the water. Position C, they climb onto the hull of the ship. Position D is they're back in the water. And then some of them made it to position E into the lifeboat, and the rest of them drowned, and they were seen floating on the water, and then they washed up ashore at Chios. That's in terms of the ones who were on the deck. However, the guy continues with his testimony and says that those who were in the cabin below, Amar, so he said, the second the water poured into the boat, he thinks they died there and then. They had no out, they had no way of getting out of that cabin. They were trapped in the cabin. And the ship turned over, and went face down all the way to the bottom. And so presumably they were all inside, and that's where they passed away. They didn't see any of those people. None of the people in the cabin. Lo Yishmael, not the Arabs, Lo Yehudi, not a Jew. None of them. Any of the people who were down there in the cabin, seeing them coming out, they didn't see. So in other words, all the dead bodies they saw floating at the top of the water, they were all recognized as people who at one point or another were on the deck. At no point did they see anyone who was in the cabin. So this is a summary of the very tragic story that comes to the desk of the Mabit Reb Moshe ben Yosef Oshrani sometime in the 1500s. So what's the question now? Those people who are in the cabin. So in terms of the question of their wives who are now widows, so is there enough from a halachic perspective to say that we know for sure that these men are dead, and so therefore these women could go ahead and marry her? Or do we say we don't have enough evidence for that particular purpose? There is no question about the people who are on the deck, because all the Jews who were on the deck were seen to be dead, floating on top of the water, and they washed up on shore. So there's enough over there to work with. We have eidos, they died, their wives can remarry. However, with the people at the cabin, none of that was observed. And so that becomes the question. And what sugya the Gemara is this? Says the Mabit, this becomes the sugya of people who drown b'mayim she'ein lahem soif. This brings us to the sugya of one who drowns in a body of water she'ein lahem soif. We'll clarify more what that means in a second. And so for that, we need to go to the Gemara in Yevamos, Daf Kuf Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph, to learn the sugya, to understand what the issue is over here. Before I say this Gemara, before we read this Gemara, I just want to tell you briefly, different time and place, completely different circumstance, but just a type of story that I really think speaks to the concern that the Chachamim had in this area. The Yavitz, Rabbi Yaakov ben Tzvi, in the 1700s, he lived in Germany, he wrote a autobiography. It's actually a very unique thing for a Gadol b'Yisrael to write an autobiography. It's called Megillah Sefer. In Megillah Sefer, toward the beginning of the book, he says the following story. His father's name was Tzvi, otherwise known as the Chacham Tzvi. He says Hamaisa about his namesake, his grandfather. His grandfather, the Chacham Tzvi's father, his name was Yaakov. This Yaakov lived through Gzeres Tachvatat, the 1648, 1649 Kabbalistic massacres in Lithuania and Ukraine. He writes the story that he heard, that his grandfather, there was a young married couple, when the pogrom began in Ukraine, and the Cossacks came and they caught him. They caught his grandfather, Reb Yaakov, and like to many Jews, they took them to a place and they started with swords, killing them one at a time. And there were Jews in the distance who were hiding, who were observing this whole thing. They observe how the Cossack is one at a time, is slaughtering Yidden. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it comes to this great rabbi, Reb Yaakov, the Yavitz Zayda. And apparently, from their perspective, they see the same thing happens to him. And so finally, days later, they go and they come and they meet the widow. They say, by the way, we saw your husband being decapitated. We witnessed it. We saw it amongst many other people in this time and in this place. It was more than one person. It was an Eidos. There was a Rav. His name was Rav Herschel Lublin, Rav Herschel Krakow. He took the Eidos. He was matter her to marry. He was matter her to marry. She didn't want to get married. She felt that she couldn't bring herself to do that. She was so distraught. She didn't marry. 6 months later, this Rabbi Yaakov walks into town. What happened? What happened was, for reasons that Al Pitav, it's a miracle. When this butcher was killing, when it came to him, for whatever reason, he had Rachmanis on him, and instead of hitting him with the blade, he hit him with the handle of the blade. In a way that it looked to the superiors who were supervising this, it looked like he was striking him, and it looked to anyone that it was striking him, but Poil not. And he was lying there for 8 days, scrambling for food. Finally, when the Cossacks left, he got up, and then it took him 6 months to figure out where to go, and he showed up 6 months later. One more detail in the story, Ziyavitz writes that the Rav asked Adam, did you see him dead? Did you see actually him dead? And they said yes, which is not true. They didn't mamish see him dead. They saw the strike of the sword, but they assume once you see that, it's like inevitable. And so, I don't know if they were close enough to actually see what exactly happened to his body, la'achar ha'maisa. But this is what they said. So Reb Herschel, the Rav, who was mad to this, was so distraught that he gave a heter aguna, that he gave a heter in this case. So he said, you know what, in a time of war, when people are so traumatized, are coming and they're going and you're afraid, it's very hard to give aid. It's like, no more, I don't want to give any, I don't want to be mater anymore, any of these agunas. He didn't want to. Other Rabbanim stepped in to deal with these problems. But that's the type of story. This is the story that the Yavitz says in the beginning of Megillah Sefer. Stam, he's writing his family history. He's not trying to bring out any point. But that was the type of concern that the Chachamim had when we're dealing with someone who's presumed dead. How do we actually for sure know that this person is dead? Because if the person is alive, then it turns out that a married woman, is now married to another man, which causes all types of problems. So that's the background to the sugya. I'm saying that a little anachronistically, that a story from the 1700s is the background for a sugya in Yavamis. But you understand what I mean. Zok the Gemara, Yavamis Kuf Chaf Aleph Amar Aleph, Tanu Rabbana. We have a brayso over here that says as follows. If an individual fell into the water, whether it's one of these two scenarios, we'll talk about that, what it means more in a second, says Rab Meir, Ishta Yasura, this woman cannot marry. Why? We're afraid the guy is still alive. We're afraid he's alive. Chachamim come along the Chachamim, and they say like this, if it's a situation of Mayim Sheyesh Lam Soif, Mayim, water that has an end, Ishta Muteres, then in fact, we say that if he was observed as falling into this body of water, well, he's presumed dead, his wife can remarry. If, however, it's Mayim Shein Lahem Soif, water that has no end, then we're taka afraid that he's still alive, and Ishta Yasura, his wife, is forbidden to remarry. What does it mean, water that has an end? Amar Abaya explains, it means, think about yourself when you're standing by a pool. When you're standing by a pool, you can see all edges of the swimming pool. So that's what Mayim Sheyesh Lam Soif means. Mayim Sheyesh Lam Soif is there's a let's say a lake, and you're positioned in such a way that you actually can see the entire circumference of the lake. And you see someone go down, and you wait 20 minutes, or a half hour, or whatever the shear is, and you don't see anyone come up, and again, you could see the entire circumference, so, said the Chachamim, this guy is dead. Rameir has the interesting shitta that you could somehow assume he's alive. The halach is not like Rameir, so we don't need to worry about that. The Chachamim say, in that case, yesh lahem soif, when you're able to see the ed, so you can presume the person's dead. What's ma'im she'ein lahem soif? Ma'im she'ein lahem soif is, when you go here, you go to the Atlantic Ocean. You can't see the edge. You can't see all four edges. You can't see any of the edges. You can see maybe where you're standing. You see one of four edges. So then in that situation, the Chachamim say, you can't say that the person went in the water and didn't come out. What do you mean didn't come out? Maybe they went out further than your eye can see. Maybe to the right, maybe to the left, maybe there. You don't know. So it's a very small chance. Yeah, but it's a very small chance. No, 100% is a very small chance. But we need to be concerned about that. And we are not going to, even though there's Adis that saw the guy go in, where if we assume, or we have to be worried about the fact that the person may still be alive, and so his wife is not going to be mutter to marry someone else. This is the basics of the sugya. Continues the Gemara, Amar Rav Ashi, says Rav Ashi, a very interesting kula in this regard. When the Chachamim said that in the case of Mayim she'ein lahem soif, Ishta Yasura, that the wife is forbidden, Hani Mili, when is that applicable? Be'inish da'alma, on a regular person. Aval tzurba ben Rabbanan, if someone is part of the rabbinic elite, la, you don't need to worry about it, even if you can't see the other end of the water. Why? Because Eid the Salik, what's the worry? The worry is he came out from the other side and he's alive. If he came out on the other side, he's alive. Kala Islay. Everyone's going to know about it. Why? Because he's from the distinguished class. He's a Talmud Chacham. People are going to talk about it. And eventually, I don't know much time it will take, but eventually you'll hear about it over here. What are we worried about? The real concern of Ashi is that there's a little guy and no one really cares about him besides for the few people left at home. So if he washed up on the other side in a new place, is anyone going to talk about it? No one's going to talk about it. Is anyone going to care about it? No one's going to care about it. So let's say you're in Eretz Yisrael, the guy washed up somewhere on the shores of Turkey. There's any reason why you would know that he's still alive? Lav Dafka, you would know he's still alive. And so that's why you need to be concerned. So Rav Ashi says that if it's a famous type of person, he doesn't say famous, he says if it's someone who's a Talmud Chacham, that would be sufficient that we wouldn't be worried about it. Concludes the Gemara, very interestingly, and says, V'lohi. We rejected Rav Ashi's opinion. Loishna inish da alma, v'loishna tzurba merabanan. We don't care if it's a regular person or if it is a Talmud Chacham. The din is going to be exactly the same. There's probably more than one way of understanding this. I'll give you one way of understanding. One way of understanding is Rav Ashi's logic is very sound, makes a lot of sense. The problem is, where do you draw the line? You want to really start getting into categorization. Oh, are you good enough of a person that there would be a conversation and word would come back? Are you not? That's why you have this concept by dinim derabanan loy plug, that we don't make these types of distinctions and we make a blanket rule, and so there is no exception. That's one way of understanding the Maskana of the Gemara, which rejects Rav Ashi's kula. Continues the Gemara and says, a very important thing. Di'eved ain't lechatchila loy. This whole thing is only lechatchila. When we say don't get married, what we mean is lechatchila, you're not allowed to get married. If, however, a man who fell into mayim she'ein lahem sof, this limitless water, and for whatever reason, and that was observed that he fell in, it's only a rabbinic kula that we're worried maybe he's still alive. If she went ahead and she got married, we're not going to say that she has to get divorced. We're not going to say that you need to separate, because then you're raising all types of questions of mamzeres. We're not going to go that far. So we will say don't get married. If, however, you went ahead and you got married, then you could remain married. This is the continuation of the Gemara. Tanya, the Gemara continues and says two stories. Amar Rabbi Gamliel said, once I was traveling by boat. And I saw another boat that had broken. I was worried because I knew some of the passengers on the ship, and I knew one of the Talmid Chachamim. Who was it? Rabbi Akiva. And when I came to dry land, I assumed Rabbi Akiva was dead. But he came and sat in front of me, and we had a discussion in Jewish law. So I said to him, B'ni, mi halacha? How'd you get out of the water? I thought you went down. Amar li, he said, I found a plank from the ship, and I took hold of it, and that brought me to shore. Amarti b'Yisashah, so Rabbi Gamliel says, that's when I said, wow, kama gdoilim divrei chachamim, how great the words of the sages. Sha'amru, who said, Ma'im sheyesh lahem soif mutara, said, if it's a limited body of water where you can see all ends, then it's fine. Then you could presume the man is dead. But ma'in she'ein lahem soif, if it doesn't have an end that is visible, then asura, it is forbidden. Because in my mind, I have for sure thought that, I can't see Rabbi Kiva anymore. The ship broke and people were drowning. I thought Rabbi Kiva drowned as well. I couldn't see him anymore. Turns out he survived. It happens. And so therefore, this is like an endorsement for the Takana de Rabbanan to be concerned about this issue. Interestingly, the Gemara continues and says another very similar story. Tanya Nocha Braisa. Amar Rabbi Kiva said, Pamachas ayisi mahalach b'sfina, I was once traveling by ship. V'reisi sfina achas shemetarefes be'am, and I saw another, broke here, doesn't use a lashon, that it broke, shenishbara, shemetarefes, and it's sinking presumably without being broken. Rabbi Kiva now has the same emotion. He's worried about a Talmid Chacham on the ship. Umanu, who's the Talmid Chacham? Rabbi Meir. In other words, he knew who's on the other boat a few hundred meters away. He knew Rabbi Meir's on it. When I came to Kapotkia is a city that used to exist. It's like the southern part of the Sinai Desert on the Mediterranean Sea, part of Egypt. Rabbi Meir shows up and he's talking to me. Amarti Loisa, Rabbi Kiva says to Rabbi Meir, same conversation. How'd you get up? How'd you survive? Amarli, he said, Gal tardeni lechavere, one wave took me to another wave. Vechavere lechavere, and that wave took me to another wave. Ad sheikiani le'abash, until I reached the dry land. This is a bigger chiddush on the prior story. The prior story, the ship broke. And the ship broke, there was a plank. Rabbi Kiva got the plank. That's a story that kind of makes more sense. In the second story, there is no ship breaking. And so there's no plank. And how does Rabbi Meir survive? He survives by surfing, essentially. He survived. Okay, so that's what happens with Rabbi Meir. So now Rabbi Kiva says, wow, Amarti B'Yitzashah, Kama Gdoilim Divrei Chachamim. How great the words of the sages. Sha'amru said, Ma'im Sheish Lahem Soif Ishta Muteres, that if you could see the edges of the water, she's okay, she could remarry. Ma'im She'ein Lahem Soif Ishta Asura. Why? Because I thought, Rabbi Meir, I thought you were dead. I thought you were not around. But Paul, you're alive. So it solidifies the concern that the Chachamim had, that if you can't see the entire circumference of the water, you don't know what is going to happen, just like Rabbi Kiva didn't know about Rabbi Meir, or as we saw before, that Rabbi Gamliel did not know about Rabbi Akiva. And so this is the sugya of Mayim sheyesh lahem sof, Mayim she'ein lahem sof. And on a very basic level, this ship that the Mabit is dealing with, this drowning happened. It was not in a limited area. It wasn't on some small lake. This happened. It will become a little clearer from the very fact that we know that the bodies washed up at Chios, which is a Greek island. So we pretty much know that it was in that area of sea that's between Turkey and Greece, which is known as the Aegean Sea. So this is Ma'im she'ein lahem sof. You can't see the other end. And so a very basic read of this Gemara is like, all these wives of these Jews who were down there in the cabin are really up the creek. That's maybe not the best pun. And so that's the problem that we're facing with. Okay, that we're facing here. So this is what the Mabit does. The first thing the Mabit does, Rav Moshe ben Yosef of Trani, is he points to a shitta, a very interesting shitta in the Rishonim. The shitta in the Rishonim is quoted by the Mordechai in Mesechus Yevamos. And he says it's a tshuva of a man by the name of Eliezer of Vordon. So this Rabbi Eliezer of Vordon, presumably is one of the Rishonim, diktek, made a diuk. The language of the Gemara is that if it's Mayin she'ein lahem sof, the woman is forbidden. It didn't say asura la'olam. It doesn't say asura la'olam shma mina, so from here you can derive the lav la'olam kamar. It's actually, this prohibition is not forever. In other words, according to this Rabbi Eliezer of Verdun, if a ship goes to sea, a guy drowns at sea, God forbid, and it's Mayin she'ein lahem sof, so we couldn't see the other end, so we don't know, ishta asura, hold on. That's only for now. That's only for now. It's going to change soon. Why? Because it didn't say la'olam. What does that mean? Indeed, this makes sense to me. Shatalu Rabbi, so what's the deal? Shatalu Rabbi Seinu al Chachmei Ador. Chazal relied on the rabbis in each generation, v'yarei shamayim, who are God-fearing, sheyiskavnu v'yaskilu al inyan hama'ura b'doinom, that they should, there's no hard rules about this. You guys, rabbis, throughout all the generations, you need to put your best effort to understand the situation based on your generation. Because in every generation, the realities of sea travel and communication, all that is going to change. And so the idea is, Ishta Asura. Yeah, Mayim She'ein Lahem Sof, Ishta Asura. Now what's going to happen? Go to the rabbis. And it's Asura for now. And then the rabbis are going to make a Chakiru Udrisha. And at whichever point it makes sense to them to say, you know something? This guy is dead. The second they reach that point, then you're not Asur anymore. This is a very, very novel Chiddush, a Shitta by Rabbi Eliezer of Ordon. The Herich Moed, and he put his money where his mouth is, because he actually dealt with a real case. And there was an Isha that was an Anaguna for 4 years. Ki nitpa baila, presumably her husband had drowned. That was the assumption. The problem is, it was Mayim She'ein Lahem Sof, and we didn't. However, so what happened? There was evidence. What was the evidence? Look at this. You'll see the flimsy evidence here. Ki akelim asher itay b'sfina ninso asfas hayam. His baggage they found at the coast. So what is, if his baggage came at the coast, presumably what does that mean? It means there was a shipwreck, which is why his baggage came here, so presumably he's dead. And it's 4 years, and he didn't show up, and we didn't hear anything. Says Rabbi Eliezer of Ordon, I'm sorry. This guy's not alive. This guy's not alive. And the Chachamim, when they made the Gzeira, what they were saying is, Asura initially, you can't get married, you gotta wait. And then the reasonable people in that generation, they need to assess. I made an assessment. What are the assessment? Based on 2 factors: 4 years and spotting the baggage at sea, at the shore, and I'm comfortable with that. Now, I'm sure you understand that many of the Rishonim were not going to be comfortable with that. And the Mordechai goes on to quote from other Rishonim. He says that Rabbi Avraham said, no, this is very difficult. Then he brings from Ravia, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yoel HaLevi. These are all Gdolim from Ashkenaz. That no. If you read the sugyas of the Gemara, you're able to see. When they wanted to introduce a leniency in order to allow a woman to marry, the Chachamim were quite good at telling you about it. For example, they allow testimony from non-Jews under certain situations in these cases. It's called Mesiach Lefi Sumai, when the non-Jew doesn't intend to testify, but is saying something casually. Usually that's not acceptable in court as testimony. Here they said it's acceptable. They went out of their way to say that. Likewise, aid me P8, usually testimony, you need to hear from the witness himself. When it comes to Aguna questions, you could say, I heard from someone who heard from someone, and that could be acceptable in a court to free up a woman to marry. Psule edus, some people who aren't qualified to testify in a real din Torah, in a real case, the Chachamim accept them for cases of Aguna. The Rabbis Kelan, there are many other, what we'll call loopholes that you have, that the Chachamim introduced. But they never said anything like you're saying. And they knew how to express themselves when they wanted to give a heter. And here is not one of the case. We find very clearly that when in a case of a body of water where you can't see the end, the Chachamim were very concerned. And they said, I know, it breaks our heart. This woman needs to remarry, but we can't. We're too afraid. The chance is too high. The guy is alive. That is the tone you get from studying Gemara of Yavamis. And so therefore, this idea that you're going to rely on something as flimsy as 4 years and the baggage at shore, no. This idea that it's up to the rabbis in each generation to just make their own assessment on their own, not having to follow any rules, no. There's rules of evidence, you have to follow that procedure, and this was the other shitta of the Rishonim. This is the machloikes that the Mordechai quotes. What's the Mabit going to do over here? The Mabit quotes this. And very interestingly, the Mabit embraces the first opinion. The Mabit embraces Rabbi Elazar's opinion, which is a very lenient position, and let's read inside. Hare, he doesn't even quote the second opinion. He just quotes the first one. Hare, we see from the Shita of Eliezer of Ordon, that rabbis need to use their mind and figure this out. Even if it's water that you can't see the other end. And how do you do this? Circumstantial evidence. You basically build a circumstantial case of evidence that the person has drowned, even when you can't see the other end of the water, and that is acceptable, because that is what the Shita of Rabbi Eliezer of Ordon. Okay. This is already a very big chiddush of the Mabit. But he doesn't stop here. And he says another point. What's his next point? Kol shekain, how much more so here? This is not a case of Mayin she'ein lam sof. Listen to what he's saying. This sea, this Aegean Sea, is not Mayin she'ein lam sof. Why? Is everyone able to see all four sides? No one's able to see all four sides. So why is he saying it's not Mayin she'ein lam sof? So this is what he goes on to say. He says, he builds the case. If you look at the language of the Gemara, you'll see when it talks about this issue, the words is nafal amayim. Person fell into the water. Let's take that literally. What does nafal amayim mean? Nafal amayim can mean there's a boat that's, traveling in the ocean, and then a person falls off from the edge of the boat and they land in the water. That's not nafal amayim. So he wants to say that that's when the rabbis had their conversation. Why? Because what's happening when nafal amayim? The guy goes into the water. You say, oh, I don't see. Yeah, but there's an individual now in an open sea. He could go right, he could go left, he could go up, he could go down, he could go backwards, he could go forward, he could go all different directions. So that's when we say we're very concerned. We don't know that you're really able to see, and maybe indeed the person came out on the other end, and that's where this all is true. However, he says, and he makes the case further, he says, look at the story in the Gemara, the first of the two stories. What was the first story? The story of Rabbi Gamliel. What happened with Rabbi Gamliel? He says, Rabbi Gamliel was on the boat, and he saw the boat next to him broke. What happens when a ship breaks? The ship breaks, essentially all the passengers are falling into the sea. So that's when you have this problem. You could go Yama, Vakema, Tzafaina, Vanegba, all different directions, so that's when we have this problem. The second story. The second story actually doesn't say the ship broke. The second story says that it was a Sfina Shenitrfa, which sounds like it's just sunk. So he says, you know something? I'm going to interpret that is talking about a ship with no rooms. It's just an open deck. So essentially when it goes under, where's everyone? They're in the open water and they can go in all different directions. And that's what the Chachamim were worried about when they said, Mayin she'ein lam sof, you don't know. You don't know, and you need to be really careful. However, he says, in our case, it's very, very different, so much so it's different. I'm not even willing to call it Mayin she'ein lam sof. Why? Because all these people were in the cabin. What's around them? One wall, two walls, three walls, four walls. And on top of them, another wall. There's one door to get out. So they're in a very confined space. So if they're in a very confined space, that's where they're staying. Now, yes, theoretically, there's a chance that one of them could slip out through the door as the ship is turning over or something like that. Understood. But at the end of the day, that's very different from someone who falls into the sea where literally he can go in all 18 directions. And here, they can't go in any direction. It's very similar, he says, almost to, God forbid, someone who has this experience when it's Maim Sheyesh Lam Sof. I'm standing here, I see the right, I see the left, I see all sides, and the people don't come out. Then I can say, okay, the person has unfortunately died inside the water. So he feels that being confined in the cabin makes it the din of Maim Sheyesh Lahem Soif, and so therefore we should say that you asked the people. You were there, yeah. Did you watch to see if people floated up? Yeah, I watched. Did you see anyone? No one. I didn't see anyone. Okay, so then the mutter. That's essentially his argument. So there's two things that he's doing here. The first thing he does is he says, I love Rabbi Eliezer of Ordon. And if you love Eliezer of Ordon, so then your analysis is basically, rabbis should sit down and they should do the math and say what makes the most sense over here in this case, and then they could just do as they see fit, essentially. Even on the smallest amount of evidence. That's his first point. And his second point is, we should treat this as a case of Mayin Sheyesh Lam Sof because of the fact that they were all in this cabin. He concludes the tshuva by saying, I'm relying on this Halachah l'maisa. I'm willing to allow all these women to remarry. But I need two other rabbis to agree with me. Okay. Well, so he's looking for other rabbis to agree with him. Who's some of the other rabbanim in Tzfas at the time of the Mabit? One of them is Rabbi Yosef Karo, the Beis Yosef. The Beis Yosef was very unhappy by this tshuva of the Mabit. And the Beis Yosef has a tshuva, this one's printed in, there's two volumes of tshuvas of Beis Yosef. One is called Efkas Reichel, one is called Beis Yosef. This one is in Shas Tshuvas Beis Yosef. He writes as follows, regarding the ship that sunk, the Kosav HaChacham and the Mabit wrote that we could permit their wives if they were b'soich hacheder, if they were in the cabin. Zeshnasayim yamim shalach li arasas. He sent me his tshuva 2 years ago. V'shalachti loyamar, I sent him a message saying, sheishtakei adavar v'lo yomer. Forget about it. Don't even say this. And when he heard I said this, he didn't go ahead and he didn't permit the marriage. However, now 2 years later, the husband still didn't show up. So some of the women are saying, we want to get married. Even though the Mabit said that you can't rely on him unless he has 2 other rabbis, and no one agreed with him yet. He did find 1 other rabbi, but at least he didn't find a 3rd one. So therefore, if these women go ahead and get married, if they're following his psak, they're actually going against his words. And really, he now turns to the Mabit and says that the Mabit should really make a macha. The Mabit should say, you guys can't get married, because I said 3 and we never found 3, we only had 2. So you see, this was like tension is building in Tzfasa around this. So I'm going to now respond, and the Beis Yosef writes a very long tshuva, refuting point by point all of the things that the Mabit says. About the words of Rabbi Eliezer of Vardon, he says, you cannot rely on it. His words are very sharp. The dvar of betelim me'atzmam. They're inherently false words. What Rabbi Eliezer said. He says, this diuk, it's not asura la'olam. Chazal, when they say asura, it means la'olam. This is not a real diuk. If you had, where every time it said asura la'olam, and then one case it didn't, then you can make that diuk. But that's not the reality over here. So he completely rejects the idea that it's only asura for now until the rabbis make their best judgment. No. So he rejects that. The next thing he says is, how could you rely on Rabbi Eliezer of Ardon when the Mordechai who quotes him immediately brings poskim who disagreed with him? In the language he says here is that Ravya machi la ahad Rabbi Eliezer mevardon amoicha. He bangs him on his head and he says no. And then he goes on to say that by the Mordechai bringing him, Mordechai is essentially saying, so why does he bring him? Because one day it's going to happen in the 1500s that there's going to be a Rav, and we know his name, who's going to come up with a svara like this. Do you know something? Maybe when it says Asr, it's not la'olam, and you make your assessment as time comes in, you make your judgment, there's no actual procedures and benchmarks of what the evidence needs to be. So what's going to the response be? So the Mordechai knew that's going to happen. So what he did is he put the shitta there. Then he put all the rabbis who disagreed, so that now and forever we know that this was a shitta that was raised and was rejected. That's why it's there. I'll add here now that most poskim throughout the generations did not accept this svara. The Mabit we see wanted to accept the svara. Most poskim did not feel that this was a fear reading of the Sugyas and Yavamis. There's a tshuva the brother of the Alter Rebbe, whose name was Reb Yehuda Leib of Yanovich. He's known as the Maharil. He is an Aguna tshuva, and he brings this shita, and he says Beis Yosef is right. So he sides with the Beis Yosef on that issue. Okay, but if you remember, that's only one part of the Mabit's tshuva. The Mabit has another part of his tshuva. What's the other part of his tshuva? Where he says that this is not Mayim She'ein Lam Sof, it's a very confined space, right? Says a Mechaber, Be'emes ein aseichel metzayer dvarim alalu. I don't buy this distinction. The mali nafol lamayim, mali shamayim bo alav. What do I care if you fell into the water, if the water came to you? He doesn't elaborate so much over here. He doesn't get so much into the svara that the Mabit, I think, was trying to say, but he clearly rejects this idea. Okay. Then he goes and says, the Mabit said another point. What was the other point the Mabit said? That because we're treating it as mayim sheyesh lahem soif, so when it's a confined space, it's not enough that it's a confined space. You also needed someone stood there, watched, and didn't see them come up. You need to have both of those. First of all, it's yesh lahem soif, we could see the edge. And number two, someone was watching and didn't see them come up. You have those two factors, you could be mat to the woman. So the Mabit has the first one by saying it's a confined space. The ship is a confined space. And then he has number one. What's his number two? His number two is there were Jews who I told you the whole story. They were on the deck. So says Beis Yosef. So really, those are the people that we're relying on over here to say the people didn't come up. And he goes on to say, let's just think about this for a second. These are people whose lives are on the line. These are people who are Haroya hazeh, these observers, they're worried to save their lives. Swimming, trying to get to the lifeboat. And then he adds a very interesting and tragic and sad detail about that part of the story. And this happens at other famous shipwrecks, where there's a fear that too many people want to get onto the lifeboat. So what happens? The people on the lifeboat don't want to let more people on. And he describes over here, V'gam sham lo hunach lahem. When the Jews tried getting into the lifeboat, they didn't let some of them on. They didn't let them go on. They were banging on their hands viciously, as we heard. One of the Jews who tried getting onto the lifeboat, they took off his hand, and he fell and he drowned. And even after that, even if they got onto the lifeboat, and some of them did, they're still in the middle of a storm. So you're going to say that during all of this, they were able to observe and say, no one came up during this time? How could you rely on that? That's even if I accept your chiddush that has the din of Mayim Sheyesh Lam Sof. How much more so, he says, that I'm not ready to accept that it has the din of Mayim Sheyesh Lam Sof, and I think it's Mayim She'ein Lam Sof. Haklala Oila, he continues his tshuva, and he says, Shedinam shal elu hu din nafal Mayim She'ein Lam Sof mamish. This is a classic case of Mayim She'ein Lam Sof, and therefore Mayim She'ein Lam Sof, Nishayseyen, Asurais Linase, because we're afraid maybe someone is alive, washed up on some island and said, you know what, I have a new life for myself. And he decided to build his new life. Ne'um Atzar Yosef Karo, this is the tshuva of Rabbi Yosef Karo. There's a continuation for the story, but we're going to kind of tune out now and move into the 20th century. But the continuation of the story very briefly is, the Beis Din called in the women who were talking about marriage, told them formally or informally, that itself is not so clear, they should not get married. There was a man that went ahead and was Mekadesh one of these women. And that caused a whole round of tshuvas now to be written about, well, we learned earlier in the Gemara that it's only lechatchila, right? But b'diavad, if they did b'diavad, so then they could go ahead with the marriage. So is that the case over here? And so Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote additional tshuvas, the Mabit wrote additional tshuvas, at least 3 or 4 other rabbis wrote additional tshuvas, so you have a nice number. This whole story of 6, 7 tshuvas all revolving around this very tragic story. But we're going to tune it out here, and now we're going to move forward into the 20th century. So there was a rabbi whose name was Rabbi Yaakov Meskin. Rabbi Yaakov Meskin, his dates are 1883 to 1956, and he was a rabbi in what's called Nova Praga, Ukraine. This is not too far from Kremenchuk, and eventually he comes over to the United States of America. He's a rabbi in Burlington, Vermont, and in 1930 he publishes a sefer called Beis Yaakov, which includes his tshuvas. Later he moves to New York, and that's where he lives out his final years. He passes away in 1956. In this tshuva, he's dealing, as you're going to be able to see, he's dealing here with a ship disaster. And he right away says, I am willing to rely on the mabit. Which element of the mabit? He likes this idea of, in a cabin is confined space. Confined space means that we could ask an observer, they said they didn't see, then we could presume dead. Then he goes on to say this following. What if you're going to have a case where you're not sure? What if you're not sure? I'm not sure if the person was in a confined space or not. So he says, so then essentially it turns into a doubt. It's a suffix, Mayim Sheyesh Lam Sof, Mayim She'ein Lam Sof. That's essentially what the doubt is going to be. So he says, so how do you deal with that? So Halachah already dealt with that, he says. He says that the Taz says that because the whole thing is anyway derabanan, it's a concern derabanan. So if there's a body of water and for whatever reason, it's not clear which category it is, but it could be the Yesh Lam Sof, then we're going to rule the Kula and we're going to allow the woman to get married. So therefore he says, if you have a ship, and it's a suffix if it was a confined space or not, so we could still say we're going to rely essentially on this mabit because it's suffix, Mayim Sheyesh Lam Sof, Mayim She'ein Lam Sof. This is what Rabbi Yaakov Meskin says in this tshuva. But then he wants to bring evidence to the shita of the mabit, or support from other poskim. Remember, especially because the Beis Yosef disagrees, it's important for him to find as much support as possible. And he quotes a Taz. The Taz is an Even Ezer, and you're going to see over here, it's essentially Mayim She'ein Lam Sof, that because of circumstances gets transformed and becomes Mayim Sheyesh Lam Sof, becomes a confined situation. So let's read the case. The Taz and Even Ezer, Siman Yud Zayin. All these issues in Shulchan Aruch are discussed in Even Ezer, Siman Yud Zayin. Zok the Taz, there was a story in the winter. The water froze over. And someone was walking on top of the water, meaning he's walking on the ice. V'haya shamaka in pasuach, and there was an open spot in the ice. K'moisha regilin lahashkes habehemis. In other words, when a lake would freeze over, they'd come and they would break through, make a little bit of a gap in the ice to allow the animals to come in to drink. However, this individual was walking, didn't realize, and nafal sham toich oisei hamakam, and he fell into that gap, v'nitba, and he drowned. V'haya mayim she'ela himsof. Observers there could not say they saw all four sides of this lake. And nonetheless, hitiru ishtai, they said this woman could remarry. And one of the rabbanim was none other than the great Maharsha. So what do you see over here? What's this Taz saying? Although it's Ma'in She'en Lam Sof, but let's use our heads. There is a blanket of ice covering the entire lake. So in that way, it got transformed into a confined space where it's Ma'in She'yesh Lam Sof. And so someone said, we stood there, we didn't see him coming up from that hole, so then you're good. So says Rabbi Yaakov Meskin, this sounds a little bit like the Mabit. What was the Mabit saying? Yeah, you're in this huge sea, but you're in a cabin, and there's only one little door to get out. So, and that's where the drowning happened. So then it's a confined space. We don't have to assume you went to all different directions, and so therefore the Din D'Rabbanan here doesn't apply, and we should be matir the woman. This is what Rabbi Yaakov Meskin says. He goes on, and he says, you know what, I want to pile on more reasons to be matir the woman. Let's read this closely. It is known to all. The Hanashim hitzilu takef barishayna balei aniyah. The owners of the ship saved the women first. The echad meha Hanashim, and one of the men, in order to save himself, in this case that Rabbi Yaakov Meskin is talking about, lavash es atzmoi bebigdei nashim, he dressed as a woman, v'nitzalai deis, and that's how he saved his life. How do I know? Ken karasi bo'ayitoinim, that's how I read in the newspapers. Im kain, if so, chazinon, we see that there was no real way for men to survive. And if this man would be alive somewhere in the world through some trick like wearing women's clothes, then the newspapers would report his name. What's he saying over here? Yaakov Meskin is saying, this shipwreck that happened, you can't assume there's a guy alive that we didn't hear about. Why? Because there's so much attention being given to any man who survived. Because the survival rate of the women is very high, the survival rate for the men is not as high. And so therefore they went to one of the men and they started investigating what happened. Turns out he dressed up like a woman. They made a whole story about that. And I think he's saying, and likewise other men. And so if this guy was alive somewhere in the world, and he's a man, and the people around him would turn it into a story. Oh, another man survived, and it turned into a media story. And they'd say, how did you do it? And we would all know about it. And yet the reality is that his name doesn't appear in any of these newspapers. What does that mean? I'm going to add that on. Again, this is not his core argument. I'm going to add that on, that this is another reason to say that we can throw it into the pot and say we can be extra confident that this guy has indeed passed away. Once we read this, it should become apparent what exactly we're talking about. We're talking about over here the famous accident of the Titanic. The accident of the Titanic happened in April 15, 1912, which was Or L'Chav Ches Nisan Tov Reish Ayin Beis. And there is indeed a story that was reported very soon after the disaster of the Titanic about a man named William Slopper or something like that, that the way he survived was by dressing up like a woman. If you go to Snopes, you'll see they think it's a complete lie. It was produced then. It's from 1912, right away then. They say never happened, it's not true, they know who made up the story and why. Ayin Sham, if you're interested in more details, but the reality is it was reported widely at that particular time. He continues, Rabbi Yaakov Meskin says, and I'm going to throw in another thing into this pot for Heter. He was living and he had a good relationship with this woman. And therefore, that's another reason why if he was alive, he would come and say something. And so, Vitziruv Kal HaHaterim, adding all these Haterim together, Nira Lani is Daiti, it seems to me, the Hai Itza Ha'aluva V'amlula, this unfortunate woman, Muteres Linas Ish, is allowed to marry, but La Halacha V'loy Lamaisa, I'm not ready to paskin yet Lamaisa, we'll see why in a second. Okay, so now let's go to the beginning of the tshuva and actually see how Rabbi Yaakov Meskin describes the actual case. Sha'ela, here's the question. Benidoin aguna achas, it was a case of an aguna, shanasa lemedina sayam, ala aniya Titanic v'nitpa. There was a individual who traveled on the Titanic and he drowned. He's one of the individuals from our city, Nova Praga, Plach Kherson, in the area of Kherson. Ushmai, his name is Shimon Meisner. Shimon Meisner, if you go to the Titanic information, his name is there. They even have his ticket number. His ticket number was 2816. He was a third-class passenger. V'hishar achar of Isha tz'ira liyamim. He left his wife. His wife's name was Sarah. Ushloisha banim ktanim, and 3 young sons. B'loi mishan u'mishana, and they have no support. Soon after the accident, this woman started pleading with me, asking me constantly that I should teach her what the din is, and is she allowed to marry someone else. Alongside this, she's also yelling at me, why did I say that the boys should not say Kaddish? And I told her that in these serious matters, I'm afraid to stick my head into this. However, because the rabbis wanted to make it good for these types of women, I decided to take the time to study the subject and to come up with a heter. And this is what I wrote to the great Goin, his teacher, Rabbi Yitzchak Yaakov Rabinovich, who was known as the Panovich Rav. He was one of the famous Rashi Yeshiva before, in the beginning, the first 2 decades of the 20th century. He was Rabbi Yaakov Meskin's teacher, and so Rabbi Yaakov Meskin turns to him and says he's going to ask him the question. You can tell from the way Yaakov Meskin is writing this. This is an intro when he sent his sefer to print, I assume. In 1930, he wrote this introduction. He's writing about what he did. This is what I wrote. B'shaitoi, the following is what I wrote. So in other words, the passages that we read so far from Rabbi Yaakov Meskin was his letter to Rabbi Rabinovich saying, this is what I think, what do you think? This is the background to this case. If you go to the next passage, we see where he actually, we already know what is his method. His method is to say, you rely on the mabit, confined space. So look, here is actually how he does it when he's talking about the Titanic. So he says, Uve kuntrais ha'agunois, in the kuntras of the agunois. So let me talk for a second about what this is. There was one of the great achronim, whose name was Rav Moshe Lema. He wrote a sefer called Chalkas Machoikik. Chalkas Machoikik is, if you open a Shulchan Aruch and Ezer, he's one of the commentators on the side, like the Shach, like the Taz, like the Magen Avram. The Chalkas Machoikik, Reb Moshe Lema. He lived in the 1600s. After Siman Yozayin and Shulchan Aruch, he decided there's so much material on Agunas and Shuvas, he wants to make like an encyclopedia. And he wrote like 300 entries of different cases of agunas and what the Rabbanim said about this. So this appears in the Shulchan Aruch after Siman Yud Zayin. The Rabbanim, like Rabbi Yaakov Meskin, in those days, did not have the Shalos HaTshuvas HaMabit. They did not have the Shalos HaTshuvas of the Beis Yosef. Not every person had access to these Svarim, but everyone had that. Everyone had the Kuntras Hagunos that was printed in Shulchan Aruch after Siman Yud Zayin. So when he's quoting Mabit and Beis Yosef, he's quoting it through this Kuntras Hagunos. So he says, Kuntras Hagunos being the opinion of the Mabit. What's the opinion? That is the main point that he wants to take away from the Maggid. If you're in a confined space, if you're in a cabin, and you go down, that's not Mayim She'ein Lo Himsof, it's Mayim She'yesh Lo Himsof, as we elaborated earlier. V'im Kain, listen how he applies this. B'haniyah Titanic, She'yadu ala kol ha'yidei ha'noisim ha'nisharim. It is known by all of the survivors, She'nishbara haniyah, that the ship, essentially a hole was created in the ship by hitting an iceberg. The take of Bo Hamayim Alasvina, and the water right away entered the ship. The Sham Nitbu Anoshim, and that's where the people drowned. It's not like people fell out into the larger sea, and therefore Harekamayim Sheyesh Lahem Sof. So what's he doing here? What he's doing is he's saying, how did the Titanic go down? There's a hole in the hull of the ship, water rushes through, confined space, everyone's in the ship, it goes down like that. It's Mayim Sheyesh Lo Himsof, like the Mabit's case. What's interesting about this is, and I didn't read what people knew in 1912, but today that's not the assumption of what happened to the Titanic. Yes, it is true. It's definitely for people in the third class that they never made it out to any of the decks or anything like that, and they were always stuck inside. But there were many, many people from the third deck who did make it, from the third class, who did make it out. One way or another, people were locked in. I don't know how much you guys know about the Titanic, but they did make it out, and they did stand on the deck. And if they were standing on the deck, then you're not in an enclosed space. You're not in an enclosed space, and you're back to the whole din of Ma'in She'ein La himself. That's besides for talking about the fact that the ship literally breaks apart in the middle, which means that the entire ship now is all, at least huge areas of the ship are open to the open sea. And so this idea of people being in a confined space is not relevant for that factor as well. So that's something that requires more thought about why is he so confident that this is the way it happened then. But here I hasten to add this very important point. Remember, he said earlier, what if it's a suffix? What if it's a suffix? I don't know if they were in the cabin or not. He says, I don't care. Because the second it's a suffix, Ma'in She'esh Lamsof, Ma'in She'ein Lamsof, what's going to be the din? The din is going to be that because it's anyway a derabanan, we're going to assume that it's lakula, so we're going to assume it's Ma'in She'esh Lamsof. So if you have a man named Shimon Meisner, and you're like, well, was he in the ship when it went down? Stuck like many people were in some sort of cabin, hallway, or room or something like that? Or was he out on the deck or in a place where he was exposed to the sea? We don't know. Okay, it's a suffix Ma'in She'esh Lamsof, Ma'in She'ein Lamsof, and so therefore it's not going to change the outcome of his din. He doesn't say this explicitly because he assumes that he doesn't even need to go there. He assumes that the whole ship went down with everyone confined within it. So that's very interesting, but again, it's not going to make a difference for the bottom line of the din. Now, we said before, he said this is Halachah v'lo l'maisa. He's not sure. He's sending a letter to who? To Rabbi Yitzchak Yaakov Rabinovich, known as the Panovich Rav. And finally, he gets a letter back from the Panovich Rav. And essentially, the question is, can you rely on the Mabit? Can you rely on the Mabit? Not the first point, where the Mabit was getting comfortable with Rabbi Eliezer of Verdun. Not that point. He doesn't bring that at all. Rabbi Meskin doesn't bring that at all. With the second point, can you say confined space equals Ma'in She'esh Lamsof? Says the Panovich Rav as follows. I received your letter. I waited to answer Yanki Inyan Aguna when it comes to an Aguna Im Amnam Ki Arbe Shaktu. Is that true? The rabbis always get involved in this. Why shall I tishaken kol yameh? The idea is we don't want her to be chained down and not have a normal family life for her whole life. That doesn't mean we need to write an answer right away. All right, so wait a month, wait 2 months. I think it's good to wait. Sometimes new information comes. So he said, I didn't rush to give you an answer. And at the same time, you really need to have patience here. And so that's why I delayed. You'll see at the end, if you go to the bottom, you'll see his letter is signed, Yom Gimel Vav Tishrei Tafresh Ayin Gimel. That's Tishrei Tafresh Ayin Gimel, so it's 6 months after the accident. So, and he's saying he delayed the response. So if he delayed a response, I'm going to assume that he got the letter by Rosh Chodesh Elul, he got the letter. And he's saying, I delayed 5 weeks. Maybe he got it earlier, but I'm saying very least he got it by Rosh Chodesh Elul. So Yaakov Meskin wrote his letter at the very latest in the summer, Sivan Tammuz. So within a few months after, that's the timeline of what's happening over here. Okay, so he says, you brought the Shita of Rav Moshe Ben Yosef Trani, the B'mayin She'ein La himself, that in a case of Mayin She'ein La himself, if you see the boat go down and everyone's in the boat, lo yechmiru. The rabbis didn't say this is a problem. Why? Because we judge it as Yesh La himself. It seems to me, although really I'm not so persuaded by what the Mabit said, that this is in fact true. At least that makes sense. Why should we add to the baseline? Why should we add to the Isser? So the rabbi said a case of a guy falls into the water. Now we're introducing a case of a guy in a confined space. Why should we add that? At the end of the day, remember, this whole idea is a chumrah because normally we would just assume the guy passed away. The Chacham said we need to be extra careful. And it's only lechatchila. Remember, b'diavad, if that person got married, we'll let them stay married. And so therefore, I'm okay with this mabit. And although others have disagreed with him, specifically who? The Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, that when we're dealing with a rabbinic law, and we're dealing with extenuating circumstances such as this, then we have the right to rely on the mabit, because in this type of situation, you're allowed to go on a das yachid. I mentioned before that the she'eris Yehuda, The Alter Rebbe's brother, Rabbi Yehuda Leib, he said, the Mabit's a das yachid. Okay, he wasn't really talking about this point. He wasn't talking about the confined space point. He was talking about Rebbe Lazar of Verdon's point. So it's not really relevant. But what Rabbi Rabinovich is saying over here is, you can rely on a das yachid. So therefore, basically, in short, he agrees to Rabbi Yaakov Meskin's heter. However, just like the Mabit, if you remember, the Mabit said, you need a bezin, you need 3 rabbanim. So here too, you need to have 3 rabbanim. And he signs his name, Yitzchak Yaakov ben Rab Shmuel Lev Rabinovich, Yom Gimel Vav Tishrei, Tov Reish Ayin Gimel Leprat Kata. This one, what's the end of the story? This woman, whose name was Sarah Meisner, so she eventually came to the United States of America with her 3 boys, whose names were Morris, Raymond, and Harry, and she remarried. She remarried a man named Jacob Glazer. They lived in Newport, Connecticut. She died in 1956, this woman did, which is the same year. Newport, Rhode Island. Thank you. Good point. And she died the same year that Rabbi Meskin passed away. Both of them passed away a few months apart in 1956. As far as I know, in terms of the Titanic, this is the only tshuva. This is the only case that's documented as a tshuva. Others have written about it, but you can't tell if it's a real case. This is a real case of a real woman who wrote a real question to a Rav. Obviously, for her, remarriage was something that was important, and Baruch Hashem, she got that. But at the same time, she wanted to do it the right way. She was committed to Halachah, and as difficult as it was, she did the right thing. She turned to her Rav, and he did what he was able to do the heter. But we were also able to see the background of what that heter was anchored on is this very novel idea of the Mabit about confined spaces within a ship, and that's essentially this sugya.